Paper 1, done. Paper 2, completed it. Now on to paper 3, the end is in sight. This rapid revision video will be looking at my predictions for the Edexcel paper 3 in 2024. The topics I'll be covering will be Germany 1918 to 1939, which is far and away the most popular topic on this paper, and then the USA conflict at home and abroad 1954 to 1975, and then finally Russia and the Soviet Union 1917 to 1941. If you're one of the very few pupils who does Mao's China, I'm really sorry, but I know nothing about that paper and I've got very little data to go on. Therefore, rather than just have blind guesses and give very, very poorly researched predictions, I've decided to leave that out. Nevertheless, that's bound to be disappointing if you are one of the people who does that paper. If that's you, I am sorry. Otherwise, let's get into it. Let's remind ourselves of the structure of the Pearson Edexcel paper 3. Paper 3 in 2024 will be on Tuesday the 11th of June in the afternoon, and it covers a modern depth study. An example of such a study is the USA conflict at home and abroad 1954 to 1975. This particular topic comprises a civil rights unit and a Vietnam War unit, and other topics are similarly organised and split up, maybe into 2 or 3 sections. For example, Germany 1918 to 1939 is broadly split between Weimar and Nazi Germany, although there's sort of a middle bit where the rise of Hitler is looked at and how he consolidated his power as well. So what questions can you expect to find in this paper? Well, regardless of the topic, the first question will be give 2 things you can infer from source A about a particular area or inquiry. You'll fill in a table for 4 marks there. Then there's an explain why question for 12 marks. That's very similar in structure to ones that you've done for paper 1 and paper 2. Question 3 is a little bit different. It's split into 4 different sections, all related to the same inquiry. You'll have 2 sources and 2 interpretations that you'll be looking at and referring to directly here, but you can also use to help inform you if your knowledge is a bit shaky on this. But of course, it is better to just have good knowledge in the first place. The first part of question 3, A, is how useful are sources B and C for a particular inquiry, and that's worth 8 marks. Then B, what is the difference between these interpretations? That is only worth 4 marks, and it's probably the easiest of the lot. But then you've got to explain why those interpretations might be different. And usually a safe bet is to refer to where the historians may have got their information. You'll find that one of the sources, B or C, will go with one of the interpretations. So for example, it might be that source B goes with interpretation 2 and source C goes with interpretation 1. So try and identify that. It makes it a lot easier. Then the big question at the end, how far do you agree with a particular interpretation's view? This is structured quite a lot like the 16 mark answers that you've done in paper 1 and paper 2, but rather than just using your knowledge, you're comparing 2 historical interpretations. And a warning here, you absolutely must compare the interpretations, not just write about your own knowledge. Like I say, that's worth 16 marks and has 4 additional marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. You'll have 1 hour and 20 minutes to complete this exam, and you must make sure that you've got the sources and interpretations booklets with you as well. If there's any problems there, just ask the invigilator and they'll help you out. Before I get into the predictions themselves, have I helped you? If yes, then please help me to help others. I'm a full-time history teacher and a head of department at a school, so originally these videos were just made for my students. Now I know that they help thousands of others too. If you want to thank me for all my work, and believe me, it has been a lot of work and I've done it all in my spare time and in the evenings, then the best way of doing that is to subscribe to the channel. That will help the YouTube algorithm drive my videos towards people and give more people access to this information in future years. So if you can do that, it would count as a tremendous thanks for me and I'd be incredibly grateful. Better still, once the exams are over, please stay subscribed, even when you don't need these videos anymore. You might be going on to do A-level history and some of these things might come up again, and I am hoping to branch out into A-level topics as I get more done. So watch this space, and again, if you really want to thank me for all my hard work, and I've worked really hard, then please do subscribe. Anyway, that's enough begging from me. As with my previous predictions videos, these come with a real note of caution. These predictions are more a demonstration of what topics have appeared only infrequently since 2018. Exam boards often use the same topics repeatedly and will consider which ones have appeared recently as well. The fact is though, the only way of being really sure is by trying to know everything. So when you're using this video, don't just focus your revision on the predictions. Instead, if a prediction happens to be in an area that you know you are weak on, use that to guide your revision and try and patch it up. And remember, I've generally got rapid revision videos on all the topics that I'm going to be mentioning here. Also, in the past, I'm aware that I've missed things off. I've got a great big confusing spreadsheet which shows all the things that have come up across the different years, and yes, sometimes some do slip through the nets. If that does happen, yep, sure, I'll take the criticism, but the best thing you can do is to help me and others out by putting it in the comments and pointing it out. I'll highlight that particular comment so other people can see that I've made the mistake. But believe me, I've tried my hardest not to make any. Let's get into our first topic, the most popular one of all, Germany 1918 to 1939. Last year's Germany 1918 to 1939 paper looked like this. Question 1 was give 2 things that you can infer from source A about education in Nazi Germany. Then the second question was explain why the Nazi Party was reorganised in the years 1924 to 1928. This included its stimulus points, elections and the Bamberg Conference of 1926. Then part 3, which is all related to the same inquiry, was all about cultural changes in the Weimar Republic. So the first part of this was how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into cultural changes in the Weimar Republic in the years 1924 to 1929. That was worth 8 marks. Then part B was study interpretations 1 and 2. They give different views about the cultural changes in the Weimar Republic in the years 1924 to 1929. What was the main difference between these views? And then suggest one reason why interpretations 1 and 2 give different views. A quick tip with that. Generally speaking, one of the sources will go with one of the interpretations and the other source will go with the other interpretation. So you might find that source B goes with interpretation 1 and source C goes with interpretation 2, or vice versa. You can, in part C here, suggest that the historians have based their views on one of these sources. You've got no way of knowing that, but it is a reasonable suggestion as to why the interpretations might be different. They've used different sources. Then the final part for 16 marks plus 4 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. How far do you agree with interpretation 2 about cultural changes in the Weimar Republic? And remember, this is structured very much like the other 16 mark answers, but you're comparing the 2 interpretations on how well supported they are and which one you agree with, rather than just using your own knowledge. And that's very important. So that's what's come up recently. Paper 3 tends to have fewer repeated inclusions because quite often the focus of the paper can be quite narrow, as question 3 is all related. However, there have been some exceptions. Challenges to the Weimar Republic, which is in itself a very broad topic, has come up several times before. The unpopularity of the Weimar Republic came up in 2021, the Treaty of Versailles also was relevant in 2021, and this was also relevant to the sample paper. Also, for some reason, the examiners seemed pretty keen on the Nazi Party in the 1920s, what's sometimes referred to as the lean years of the Nazi Party when they didn't do very well. This came up in the sample paper in 2021 and also in 2023. I'm going to have a look at question 3, A, B, C and D separately. This question has an awful lot of marks attached to it, so it's quite interesting to see what has been the focus each year and in each paper. The sample paper was on a Nazi Germany topic, this time looking at the Hitler Youth. Then in 2018, the first public exam, the Weimar Republic was the focus, this time looking at challenges to the Weimar Republic in its early years. Then 2019 looked at Nazi Germany again, looking at the experience of women this time. Then in 2020, which admittedly was an exam that very few people would have done, it looked at Nazi Germany and the extent of support that it had the Nazi Party had, I should say, between 1933 and 1939. Then in 2021, the focus returned to the Weimar Republic, with support for the Nazis 1924 to 1928, and then the Weimar Republic again with the way that Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. Admittedly, the 2021 and 2022 papers both kind of straddle the divide between the Weimar Republic and the very early stages of Nazi Germany. Then last year's paper focused on the Weimar Republic again, this time much more securely, looking at Weimar cultural changes. I'm not a betting man, I'm really not. But perhaps we are due another life in Nazi Germany focus for this question now. A reminder though that you'll have sources and interpretations to help you with your knowledge here, even if it happens to be on something that you're really not confident on. So will it be something on life in Nazi Germany this year? Only time will tell, but we will see. In terms of the 2024 predictions then, with my usual notes of caution, according to my preparations, these topics have all never appeared. Looking at Weimar Germany first. Women in Weimar Germany has not appeared in its own discrete question, although in truth it probably would have been relevant to last year's question on cultural changes. But what about workers and the standard of living in Weimar Germany? They've not really had their own discrete question either. Hitler's early career. Well, I almost didn't include this one because actually this all occurs before the date range of this particular course. However, it is included in the textbook for a bit of context. I think it's unlikely it'll form the basis of many marks within the exam, if any at all, but it's just something to bear in mind, so I wouldn't spend too long on it. On the other hand, I think it's really surprising that the Munich Putsch has never really appeared. It may have been a little bit relevant to some of the lean years of the Nazi Party questions, but really it comes earlier than that, and so it's strange that such a big and well-known event has not been included in its own question before. Will 2024 be the year to change that? We will see. Also, unemployment in Weimar Germany has not come up in its own discrete question either, although it would have been relevant to questions looking at the nature of the increase in support for the Nazis before Hitler became Chancellor. So maybe we can say this one has sort of appeared, just not discrete. What about the Nazi Germany section then? The Knight of the Long Knives has never appeared, as far as I can tell, in its own discrete question. It may have appeared relevant to the question about Hitler becoming Chancellor, but that actually specified 1933 only, so the Knight of the Long Knives, being in 1934, wouldn't have counted. The Nazi legal system and how it was used as a mechanism to control people in Nazi Germany has also not appeared in its own discrete question. Perhaps one that I might say is a favourite for the interpretations question though, because it's so broad, is relations with the Church. Relations with the Church is a broad one because it does involve people being opposed to the Nazis and support for the Nazis, or at least turning a blind eye as well. Because it's so broad and because it's got those two sides to it, maybe that's one that I might say would be a good one for the interpretations question. Although that would have to be a massive prediction, and if it's right, frankly, I'll eat my hat. Hey, but you never know. Also, like with the Weimar Germany section, workers and the standard of living in Nazi Germany hasn't appeared in its own discrete question either, although there have been questions about support for the Nazis, which would kind of be relevant when you look at things like strength through joy. The last one is racial beliefs as a discrete topic. Yes, there have been questions on persecution before. There's been a question on Kristallnacht, for example. But looking at the specific and, let's be honest, disturbing racial ideas of the Nazis has not come up as a discrete question before, as far as I can tell. If I've made any mistakes, I've got no doubt you'll put it in the comments and I'll highlight it. The following are all things that have only rarely appeared. Looking at Weimar Germany first of all. The German Revolution itself in 1918 and the events surrounding it had some relevance in the 2018 exam, as did the setting up of the Weimar Republic. However, in the Nazi Germany section, culture in Nazi Germany has hardly come up at all, particularly things like the control of art, and that can be related to propaganda too. There was a question in 2018 about the Olympics, which would have been relevant to this, but nothing's really appeared since then. Women and families in Weimar Germany hasn't come up either. Again, there might have been some mention of this in questions broadly looking at support, but as a discrete part of the course, it's not really been covered before, which is maybe slightly surprising. There have been questions on children though. And as I've already mentioned, persecution of minorities has only appeared really once as a discrete question. That was a fairly narrow question on Kristallnacht, and it appeared in 2021. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, of course, in terms of all the awful things that the Nazis did. So there are plenty of other things that have not yet appeared. So that's my summary for my predictions for Germany 1918 to 1939, the most popular topic for paper 3. We'll see how many, if any, I get right. Best of luck. Now let's have a look at the next topic. USA conflict at home and abroad 1954 to 1975. This is split between the civil rights and Vietnam topics. Last year's exam looked like this. Question 1 was give 2 things that you can infer from source A about the Strategic Hamlet programme in Vietnam. And then question 2 was explain why the USA was involved in peace negotiations 1972 to 1973 about the war in Vietnam. The stimulus points were President Nixon and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The inquiry in question 3 was an inquiry into attitudes in the USA towards involvement in the Vietnam War. So the two sides here are really support and opposition. So question 3A was study sources B and C. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into attitudes in the USA towards involvement in the Vietnam War? And then question 3B was about the interpretations. They give different views about attitudes in the USA towards involvement in the Vietnam War. What is the main difference between these views? Predictably enough, question 3C is suggest one reason why interpretations 1 and 2 give different views about attitudes in the USA towards involvement in the Vietnam War. It gives you a bit of a hint here. You may use sources B and C to help you explain your answer, and in fact if you do, it's probably the easiest way of picking up 4 marks with this question. Try and identify early on which source goes with which interpretation. You'll find that one of the sources backs up one of the interpretations and the other source backs up the one that you've not yet used. So for example, source B might go with interpretation 2 and source C might go with interpretation 1. You can then suggest that these historians have used different sources, such as the ones in sources B and C, to come up with their interpretations. Sure, you can't prove that, but it is a reasonable thing for you to say. And then the big one, worth a total of 20 marks, 16 for the question, 4 for spelling, punctuation and grammar. How far do you agree with interpretation 2 about attitudes in the USA towards involvement in the Vietnam War? The structure of this one here is pretty similar to the 16-mark essay questions that you've written in papers 1 and 2. However, the difference here is you're not just testing your knowledge, you're actually testing the interpretations. So don't just write what you know, test the interpretations, refer to them very specifically and very explicitly, and you should be comparing their strength. Which one do you agree with and why? Make sure you do that and you should do pretty well. Okay, now let's consider what things have appeared before. The nature of the paper 3 exam means that often the knowledge base to it is pretty narrow. That means there aren't that many things that are repeated inclusions. There is an exception to this though with this particular paper, and that's opposition to the Vietnam War, which in itself is a very broad topic, but with a particular focus on media coverage. This was included as part of the sample paper with the inferences question worth 4 marks. Also the 2021 exam with, again, the inferences question worth 4 marks. Then the 12-mark explain question in 2022 was related to this topic, and then believe it or not, the 2023 exam also had relevance to this with the attitudes question, which was the interpretations question 3 in last year's exam. What this demonstrates to us is what I've always said, that sometimes a topic can appear repeatedly, and here we can see it's come for 3 years in a row. Although admittedly, opposition to the Vietnam War is a very broad topic, and so it could look at very different aspects to it. But if I was a betting man, and again, as I've said before, I'm not really, I'd be pretty surprised if it came up for a 4th year in a row. I wait to be proved wrong, but hopefully I won't be. Now let's consider what's come up in question 3 in previous years. Because question 3 covers so many marks and is so important to your overall result, we're going to consider what topics have appeared before. The sample exam paper was on a civil rights topic, looking at Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education case. Then in 2018, the first exam to be sat by members of the public, it was a Vietnam topic, looking at the Tet Offensive. Then in 2019, there was another civil rights focus. This was the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and achievements of the civil rights movement. Then 2020 returned to the Vietnam War, looking at the reasons for US failure in that war. Then in 2021, it was another civil rights topic, this time looking at life in the 1950s. So you'll notice it's basically alternated every year so far. But then in 2022, it stayed with the civil rights, looking at the impact of the Black Panthers. And then in 2023, it stayed with the civil rights topic again, the Freedom Summer and the Mississippi murders. So what are we looking at for 2024? Is it going to be 4 civil rights topics in a row? Personally, I'd be quite surprised by this. So I would suspect that we're due a Vietnam focus for these questions. But again, this might be another example of the examiner trying to catch us out, so don't quote me on that. But if it does come up, I wouldn't be at all surprised. Remember though, whatever comes up, you've got the sources and the interpretations to help you with it. So hopefully you can feel confident going into question 3. With the usual note of caution then, let's consider the topics that have never appeared. It should be pointed out that the way I do this is by looking at all the exam papers and plotting the topics and what questions they appeared in a great big spreadsheet, which can get pretty confusing at times, but I don't know a better way of doing it. It does allow me to update it every year though. That means I have been known to miss things, and if I've done that again, although I assure you I've tried not to, please do put it in the comments below so that I can highlight it and let other people know. So let's consider the topics for civil rights. One thing that has never appeared as a discrete question is the murder of Emmett Till and its impact in kick-starting the early civil rights movement in America in the 1950s. Yes, it's a pretty distressing topic, this one here, but it's not come up before, even though it's only a small part of the course. Perhaps a little bit more surprising on the face of it are the early 1960s protests like the Greensboro sit-ins, the Freedom Riders, James Meredith and his induction into the State University of Mississippi. Although I should point out that this would have been very relevant to the 2019 interpretations question 3 though. But they've never had their own discrete question as far as I can tell, even though they would be ideal for looking at, for example, sources and explanations. Then Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam have never come up, and yet the Black Panthers have a couple of times. So maybe it's time for Malcolm X and maybe the Black Power movement to come up this year. Though as I have already pointed out, the Black Panthers have appeared before. Also looking at the 1960s, particularly later on, riots and the Kerner report that looked into the causes of riots in black communities has also not come up before as a discrete question. And also Martin Luther King's campaign in the North has never come up as its own discrete topic. So there's quite a few things here that have never actually appeared on the paper before. But what about the topics that have never appeared for the Vietnam element of the course? Firstly, the Geneva Accords, which is the peace agreement after Dien Bien Phu that ended French rule in French Indochina or Vietnam, hasn't come up before. It's a fairly complicated part of the early part of the course, so if it did come up it would be a challenging question, but you could revise it now. Also, although opposition to the Vietnam War has come up several times, support for the Vietnam War has come up far less often. I've put this in the never appeared section because it's not had a discrete question about it before, for example asking about Nixon and the silent majority, the hard hats and the fear of communism, etc. Although it is worth bearing in mind that this was quite an important part of 2023's attitudes question though, but we have seen the same thing turn up more than once, so I've decided to put it here on balance. In terms of the things that have only rarely appeared, especially those that have not appeared for a very long time, we can consider these from the civil rights part. So Brown versus Topeka, which is the landmark education case which desegregated education in the mid-50s, has only appeared in the sample paper. Related to that is the Little Rock Nine, which appeared as part of the source question in 2019 only. And despite its importance and fame, the Montgomery bus boycott was only in the sample paper and the 2018 paper. So although it's appeared twice, it has been a very long time since it's been there, and it's a really famous topic. So could it appear this year? With the Vietnam section, French rule in Indochina has only appeared in the sample paper, as has the Dien Bien Phu battle in 1954, which ended French rule in French Indochina. Zine's rule has only appeared in the sample paper, and it's worth bearing in mind that Zine was in effective power in Vietnam for quite a long time, really from after French rule collapsed until he was murdered in 1963 as part of a coup. So looking at the ways that he, for example, was particularly awful to Buddhist people and persecuted them, how he was corrupt, and how ultimately he didn't take the advice of the USA and therefore was toppled, that could be quite a broad one to look at, and maybe it would be a good one for the interpretations questions. I suppose we'll see. The Tet Offensive has only come up in 2018 as well, but I would give a note of caution on this one here. When it came up in 2018, it did make up question 3, so it had an awful lot of marks attached to it. Anyway, that's covered civil rights and Vietnam with the USA conflict at home and abroad 1954 to 1975 topic. We'll see how many of those I got right. Whatever happens, best of luck with the exam. Now let's move on to the final topic I'll be covering in this video. Now we'll have a look at Russia and the Soviet Union, 1917 to 1941. Okay, this is the topic that I know least about as I've not prepared a rapid revision series on it. Sorry for anyone studying it. And also it's not something that I've taught before, although I do find it really interesting. So if this is a little bit less detailed, I'm sorry about that, and we'll just have to see how I do on the predictions. I've used the same methodology as I have on the other topics, which I am more familiar with though. Let's get into it. So last year's exam in 2023 was give 2 things that you can infer from source A about the aims of the Kornilov revolt. That was worth 4 marks. And question 2 was explain why the NEP was introduced in 1921. Apologies, but I forgot to write down the stimulus points on that, although I will have recorded it in my matrix when I'm doing the later predictions. Question 3A was how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the main reason why Stalin's purges began. And so the inquiry here is all about Stalin's purges, and that will be the same for all of the parts of this question. 3B was about the interpretations. Study interpretations 1 and 2. They give different views about the main reason why Stalin's purges began. What is the main difference between these views? And then related to that, suggest one reason why interpretations 1 and 2 give different views. You're encouraged to use the sources to do this, and I'd encourage you to do that as well, as it's probably the easiest way of picking up the 4 marks. Try and work out fairly early on which source goes with which interpretation. You'll find that source B will either support interpretation 1 or interpretation 2, and then when you've decided that, source C will go with the other unused interpretation. It is perfectly reasonable for part C to suggest that historians have used different sources, and then suggest sources B and C. Sure, you can't actually prove this is what those historians did, but it is a reasonable suggestion and it is a way of explaining why the views differ. And then part D. How far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the main reason why Stalin's purges began? It's really important with this question that you are comparing the interpretations and how far you agree with them, rather than just writing about what you know about that particular inquiry. You must be comparing the interpretations to get the marks. This is worth 20 marks in total, with 4 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So let's consider what has appeared repeatedly. The nature of the paper 3 exam means that the knowledge base is often quite narrow because question 3 takes up so much of the exam paper and only really looks at one inquiry. However, there have been some things that have appeared repeatedly. For example, the Russian Civil War, which is a pretty broad topic, let's be honest, has appeared in the sample paper and also the 2020 and 2021 exams. Although admittedly, these were held in November because it was during the pandemic, and so not a lot of candidates did those particular papers. Collectivisation has also appeared before in the sample paper in 2018 and also in 2022. Now we're going to have a look at question 3 more specifically. I'm going to do a focus on question 3 because it takes up so many marks and so much of your time in the exam. So it's quite interesting to see which of these big topics have been looked at before. In the sample paper, the focus was on Stalin's Russia, looking at collectivisation. Then in 2018, it was on the revolution/Bolshevik Russia section. Now I'm aware that might not be the way that it's been taught to you, but for me it kind of makes sense that this particular course is split in two, looking at the revolution era and Bolshevik Russia, and then looking at Stalin's rise and his time in power. Anyway, bit of waffling there. 2018 looked at the revolution and Bolshevik era in Russia and the Kornilov revolt. In 2019, you got Stalin's Russia, which included the 5-year plans. In 2020, it looked at Stalin's Russia again, this time looking at people's lifestyles, and this time specifically looking at workers in towns. Then in 2021, it returned to the earlier part of the course again, the Revolution and Bolshevik eras, looking at challenges to the Bolsheviks. And then in 2022, it returned to Stalin's Russia, looking at Stalin and his rivals. And then in 2023, it stayed with Stalin's Russia and looked at the origins of the purges. So in 2024, my guess would be that we're due a revolution/Bolshevik focus, and here's why. When we look at the breakdown, we've got at least 5 different sections, including the sample paper, which are focused on aspects of Stalin's rule. Now that might be expected because it is a bigger part of the course, but I've just got a gut feeling that the revolution and Bolshevik Russia section might come up this time. I might well be proved wrong though, because as I've already admitted, I've not actually taught this course before, so it is the one I'm least familiar with. But you never know, we'll see if I'm right. Now, with our usual note of caution, let's consider the things that have never appeared. Again, and I know I keep mentioning this is not the topic that I actually teach, so if I have made any mistakes here on my spreadsheet, please do mention them in the comments. I'll highlight them and try and let everybody know. So looking at the revolution/Bolsheviks part of the course, the establishment of the provisional government never seems to have appeared, although questions about the provisional government have been included in a more general sense. Lenin and his actions during the Bolshevik Revolution have not come up as their own discrete topic. And the early Bolshevik decrees as part of the constitution have not come up either. Also, the reorganisation of the Bolsheviks into a more centralised system, looking particularly at Lenin and the Politburo, doesn't seem to have appeared either. So if any of those areas are particularly weak for you, it might well be worth brushing up on them. I'm just sorry I don't have a rapid revision section on this year, though I'm hoping to put that right for next year. I suppose that doesn't help you though, sorry. Let's consider the things that have never appeared for Stalin's Russia. This is quite a long list. Now that could be because question 3 narrows the focus and the different content that's covered in these exams so much, or is it because I've missed anything? Well, I've not noticed that I've missed anything, but if I've made a mistake, again, whack it in the comments. Firstly, Stalin as leader has never come up as its own discrete question, although it would be very related to the 2022 sources and interpretations question for question 3. The NKVD, show trials and labour camps as part of the terror apparatus that controlled people in Russia during Stalin's reign has also not come up as part of its own discrete topic. Speaking of control, propaganda, culture, education, religion and the media have not had their own discrete question, and nor has the 1936 constitution. Agriculture hasn't actually been in there before, although the successes and failures of agriculture related to collectivisation has appeared on the sample paper, so maybe that's one of the ones that's less likely. We'll see. The failure of the NEP specifically hasn't appeared either, although the introduction of the NEP was in the 2023 exam, so very recently. Industrialisation has been a big thing that's not come up before, except it would have been useful in some things in passing, I'm sure. And differing experiences of different people in Stalin's Russia, for example social groups, has not come up either, and nor perhaps surprisingly has family life and women. Now it may well be that I've not identified these things because as I'm reading the questions, having never taught it, I've missed things. If that is the case, again, please do correct me. I don't mind at all. You'll only help people if you do. Goodness me, can you tell that my voice is getting a bit tired? Probably about as tired as you'll be by the end of these exams. Anyway, let's have a look at the topics for Russia which have rarely appeared. For the Revolution and Bolshevik section, there seems to be a big gap right at the start. Threats to the Tsarist regime, the impact of World War I, triggers for the revolt, for example Petrograd, strikes, etc. They haven't appeared since 2019. Is it their time to appear again? Also, the weaknesses of the provisional government hasn't appeared for an awfully long time, although it did appear in the first set of public exams in 2018. Reasons for the Bolshevik victory, though, that's only come up in the sample paper so far, although I'm sure it would have been relevant to some of the other Bolshevik questions that have come up. Looking more specifically at Stalin's Russia, the cult of Stalin hasn't actually come up since 2021, although that's reasonably recent, as it's quite such a big part of the propaganda part of it. Maybe that's an outside shout, but like I say, 2021 is reasonably recent. Industry, though, does seem to be one of the bigger gaps. The 5-year plans have come up before, but Gosplan, the Stakhanovite movement, none of those things have come up since 2019. And in fact, in 2019, I believe it was the 5-year plans rather than Gosplan and the Stakhanovite movement. So maybe it's their turn this year. All right, well, that's covered Russia and the Soviet Union, 1917 to 1941. I'm sure I'll be a little bit more confident predicting next year once I've made the rapid revision videos. But let's move on to the very final points. Other than saying good luck, just a few reminders. These predictions were more a demonstration of what topics have appeared only infrequently since 2018, or perhaps have actually appeared very recently. Do remember that the exam boards often use the same topics repeatedly, and so the only way of being sure is to try and know everything. So when using this video, don't just focus your revision on the predictions. Instead, if a prediction happens to be in an area that you know that you're weak on, use this as a guide to your revision and try and patch up those areas, because you never know, they might well come up. Once the exam is done though, move on. You have finished your history GCSE and you should be blooming proud of yourself. Now, I've had a few people asking my advice as to whether their answers would be worth marks. I would remind people that I know that might feel reassuring, but I'm always really reluctant to answer those sorts of questions. What if I mention something and you wish you'd included it? You're going to feel dreadful about it moving up to August. So genuinely, my advice is to just kind of forget about it and move on and enjoy the rest of your summer, because you have certainly earned it by now. And also, please bear in mind, I don't actually have the exam board's mark schemes with me, so I can never be really sure about what will count on the exam papers or not. So that note of good luck and that little note of advice aside, just one final little bit of begging. If I have been helpful to you, and I really do hope that I have, please thank me by staying subscribed once your exams are over. It'll just help the algorithm recognise me, because inevitably enough I do get a bit of a drop off in views. In fact, my views pretty much go down to zero immediately after the exams and only really pick up again in the new school year. YouTube's algorithm doesn't really understand that sort of thing, so you staying subscribed really helps the channel and will help promote this sort of content for other students in future year groups. So aside from that, unless I do branch into A-levels next year and you're carrying on with your history studies, I think I've waffled on quite long enough. You're probably totally bored of my voice, so thank you for watching, thank you for subscribing if you have, good luck for the exam, and well done. Whatever happens in August, I hope you can be truly proud of yourselves. Thank you and goodbye.